Hi, I'm Adam Summer. You're listening to the Yerushalmi Talk podcast with the support of the Yeshivat Devar Yerushalayim in Har Nof, Jerusalem. This is Kilayim, Chapter 8, Halacha 3 in the Arch Grower on 72b1, and today we're going to deal with other cases of animals of different kinds. The first case is going to be dealing with animals of different kinds pulling a wagon again. That's something that we covered before. The Mishnah says that one may not tie a horse to the sides of a wagon nor to the back of a wagon that is pulled by oxen. Again, the Torah says that a mixed pulling pair is forbidden for plowing. In other words, you can't have a donkey tied to an ox. What about a horse? But it's not pulling the plow, it's tied to the back. Is that going to be forbidden? Mishnah says it's not allowed. So what could the horse be doing where it's tied to the back? Well, you want to transport your horse, and you're not using the horse for pulling, and the horse is just following the wagon. That's all it's doing. It's being pulled. The wagon is being pulled by the oxen. So why is this forbidden? Well, we're going to get into that in the Mishnah, in the Gemara. The Gemara says, nor may one tie the livadox to the camel. The livadox is a type of donkey that looks like a camel. Why is this in here? Because this is trying to drive home the idea that even if something looks like the same species, it's going to be forbidden as Kilayim. And we covered this earlier in Masechet Kilayim in chapter 1 with the pairs of fruits. So one of the chapters was one of the halachot was dealing with fruits that will look like another fruit, like with the seeds, where the seeds will resemble one another. And so the resemblance is not enough. It's not enough that it's going to be like the same species, so that even if it's different species, it's going to be forbidden. So just having resemblance is not enough to protect something from the laws of Kilayim. The Mishnah looks at the status of a mule in regard to the laws of Kilayim. And again, the mule is going to be the crossbreed between a donkey and a horse. Rabbi Yehuda says that all mules born of a female horse, although their father is a donkey, are permitted with one another. Similarly, those born of a female donkey, although their father is a horse, are permitted to one another. However, those born of a female horse with those of a female donkey are prohibited to one another. In other words, Rabbi Yehuda is saying that the female donkey and the male horse is going to be Kilayim with the opposite type of mule. In other words, that you had a mule that's born from a female horse and a male donkey. So he's saying that this is going to be like Kilayim with one another because it's like they're different species. Now, he's saying, Rabbi Yehuda is saying that if you have a female horse and a male donkey, that's going to be fine to pair with the same type. Vice versa, if you have a male horse with a female donkey, that's going to be fine if you're pairing it together. The problem is that when you're switching it. Now, the Vilna Goan points out that in Bavli Hulin, Rabbi Yehuda is actually unsure whether or not the father's species is taken into account, and is saying that only out of doubt in the next part of the Mishnah is he forbidding coupling of a mule whose mother and a horse and whose father is a donkey and a mule would be the issue. So in this view, says the Vilna Gaon, Rabbi Yehuda is unsure as to whether or not we take the father species into account when we're looking at this mission. Rabbi Yehuda saw the need to teach that two mules of identical lineage are permitted, and we're going to be wondering what happens if they're switched. So again, the point is that Rabbi Yehuda is unsure about that, and so he's going to be recorded in this Mishnah like this. What's interesting about this is this going to be the same species? In other words, Rabbi Yehuda is bringing out a very good point. If you have a mule that comes from a female horse and a male donkey, and he's being bred with another mule with a female horse and a male donkey, well, the sexes of the parents aren't switched. So is that really going to be like the same species? So the Gemara is going to get into this where it says one may not tie a horse to the sides of the wagon nor to the back of the wagon. again, where it's pulled by an ox. There's a dissenting view. There's a brisa that teaches Rabbi Meir exempts from malchus somebody who drives such a wagon. So Rabbi Meir is holding that driving this kind of wagon is not considered working with Kilayim because the horse is not pulling the wagon together with the ox. He's just walking alongside or behind the wagon. So the brisa is stating that Rabbi Meir exempts, which means that he exempts the driver of the wagon from the biblical punishment of malchus. So the Tana of the Mishnah, who disagrees with Rabbi Meir, is holding, says the Rosh Hashanah, that this is a biblical transgression. So Rabbi Meir's point is basically saying that, look, only the animals in the front of the wagon are going to be counted, and the animal that's trailing behind is not going to count. But the brisa continues with a case in which Rabbi Meir agrees with the Tana of the Mishnah, and it says, however, if the horse assists the ox in pulling the wagon, whether in the ascent or the slope of the descent, all agree that it's prohibited to drive the wagon. In other words, Rabbi Meir is agreeing, it says in Marafulda, that one is liable for driving a wagon if it's going up the slope of a hill, because when going up, the horse is going to help the ox in hauling the wagon upward. And also, if it were going down, the horse is going to prevent the wagon from rolling down the hill too quickly. And it's going to help to stabilize the ox from getting like pushed over or rolling down the hill too quickly and knocking down the ox. So it's going to add stability, which improves the pulling of it. And everybody agrees that that's going to be a problem. So the Gemara explains why the Tana of the Mishnah prohibits tying a horse to the back or the side of a wagon that's being pulled by an ox. Rabbi Yochanan explains it by saying that this is because one bears the laziness of that one, and that one bears the laziness of this one. So most of the time the wagon is being pulled by the ox, and the horse is merely just following along. But sometimes the ox is going to get tired, and then the horse is going to pull the wagon from the side or push the wagon with its body from the back. And now that's going to be those times where that's triggered the Kilayim prohibition, so the whole situation is forbidden. In other words, even though the horse is only doing it for a fraction of the time, that because it can happen for a fraction of the time, the whole situation is a forbidden situation. There's a different reason, and I like this one. The Rav says that it is because they are carrying the rope that is between them. In other words, both the ox and the horse bear the weight of the rope that connects the horse to the wagon. And since the end of the rope is tied to the wagon, which is being pulled by the ox, and then the horse is on the other end, the horse and the ox are viewed as carrying the rope together with the horse. The Tana of the Mishnah holds that this joint effort, even if it's a slight one, is enough to trigger the horse and the ox as being viewed as working together. I think that's a very clever idea because even if there's a minimal amount of help that is coming in this, then and it's between two different species, that's going to make it forbidden. I think it's very clever. Now, according to Rav's explanation, it's forbidden to lead animals of Kilayim even if the only labor they're doing is carrying the rope that's tying together. And based on this, Gemara asks and says, Rabbi Yerushalmi asked and said, if they were tied together by their hair, is leading them permitted? In other words, somebody tied the donkey or the horse together by their hair, by maybe the mane or the tail, and neither animal is hitched to the wagon, nor they're doing any work. And Rabbi Yerushalmi is asking whether, according to Rav, they are doing work because they're carrying the hair of each other. And probably that would be fitting Rav's point, right? Rav's point is that even a minuscule amount of weight, if it's now shared between these two animals, is going to be enough to trigger it, trigger a Kilayim prohibition. Now, the Gemara analyzes the question, says, what case are we dealing with here? And it says, if it's the case where somebody tied one animal by its hair to the hair of the other animal, leading them is certainly permitted. After all, would we say that it's forbidden to mount an animal on the back of its companion of a different kind? Certainly not. Therefore, Rabbi Yerushalmi could not have been dealing with this case where the animals are joined directly by the hair. And if the case is where he tied a rope to the hair of one animal or tied the other end of the rope to the hair of the other animal, we would certainly say that leading the animals is certainly prohibited. So because they are carrying the rope that is between them, which is the very point of Rav in the first place. So in conclusion, the Gemara is looking at Rabbi Yirmiya's question and is breaking it down and saying, well, if you tied the rope to the hair and then the rope was connected to the wagon, well, that would be enough. So yes, it's supported by the hair and it's supported by the rope, and that's going to be enough to count as leading. Now, the Gemara returns to this dispute between Rav and Rabbi Yochanan concerning the reason behind the Mishnah's ruling that you're not allowed to lead a wagon that's being pulled by an ox from the front, and it has a horse attached to the side or the back. And Rabbi Yonah says that Rav and Rabbi Yochanan disagree about the reason for the Mishnah's ruling. Rabbi Yochanan says it is because this one bears the burden of laziness of that one, and that one bears the burden of the laziness of this one. And Rav says it is because they are carrying the rope that is between them. However, what practical difference comes between these two reasons? In other words, there must be some practical difference between these reasons, otherwise the Gemara wouldn't have recorded it. So the Gemara is going to answer, in fact, there's no practical difference between two reasons. They were recorded only to teach the practical application that's common to both of them. And the Gemara concludes and says that a practical application emerges when one tied the horse by its hair to the wagon. And in that case, both according to Rav and according to Rabbi Yochanan, one is exempt from malchus for driving that wagon. So Rabbi Yochanan and Rav are agreeing that in the case that driving the wagon does not violate the prohibition of leading Kilayim, Rabbi Yochanan's explanation of the Mishnah was since the horse is tied by the rope to the wagon, driving the wagon is prohibited because a horse will sometimes pull or push the wagon. His explanation does not apply when the horse is tied to the wagon by its hair, because it will not push or pull the wagon at all on account of the pain. So Rav's explanation was that both animals are doing work by carrying a rope that links the animal to the horse, the horse to the wagon, the animal to the wagon. And this explanation also does not apply when the horse is tied to the wagon because it's not linked by a rope. So in the case that we saw, as explained by Rabbi Yirmiya was saying, was, well, what happens if you've tied the rope to the hair of the animal? Well, that looks like it's going to be forbidden. But this case is a little bit different. This is a case where they've actually tied maybe the tail of the horse to the wagon, and they're basically saying that that's not going to be. Why? Because it's painful for the horse to push or pull from when it's being used, what's the intermediate thing from it? It's its tail, it's its own part. And so it's not like, it's tied to just a rope. So the Mishnah looks at the next part, and it says, nor may one tie the livdekas to the camels. And again, this is going to be something that looks like a camel. And the Gemara says that there is a Tana who teaches the Mishnah as reading nivrekas. So the Gemara is going to look at the wording, the way the words look between the names of the livdekas and nivrekas. And actually, it's going to be the same thing. So the one who says the correct name is livdekas holds that it is named after a place in origin being Libya. And in accordance with the verse with Libyans, Luvim, and Cushites, which is crushed in the footsteps. This is, by the way, Daniel 11:43. And at the time of the end, the king of the north will plunder Egypt and crush the inhabitants of the neighboring lands, being Libya and Cush, which is going to be the land south of Egypt, like in Ethiopia areas. And the Gemara continues and says the one who says that the correct name is Nivrekas holds that the animal is known as the Avchatam. And the Gemara asks, what is the Avchatam? And the Gemara replies, a tall donkey. So the word salak comes from the Aramaic root rise, and that's conveying the type of donkey being large and tall like a camel. So the Gemara discusses a creature that originates from Libya, and the Torah states that an Egyptian convert, and his children cannot marry a member of the congregation by the third generation. So the Gemara wants to know whether Libyan converts are subject to the same restriction. Again, this is getting back to figuring out the etymology of the word of this camel or donkey. So Rabbi Yonah says that Rav Hoshaya inquired regarding converts that originate from Libya and says, what is the law as to whether they have to wait 3 generations for them to be allowed to marry into the congregation? Again, we know that Egyptians are, but what about Libyans? So Rabbi Yonah Bat's Raya answers Rav Hoshaya's question. Rabbi Yonah of Batsra says the answer emerges from that which we see concerning the Egyptian bean, the cowpea. It says, while it is fresh, it is called the Libyan bean, and when it is dry, it is called the Egyptian bean. And this link between Egypt and Libya teaches that a convert from Libya has to wait 3 generations before marrying into the congregation, just like an Egyptian convert. And this tells us that Libya is effectively the same as Egypt. And the Gemara decides the halacha and says that Rav Yitzchak bar Nachman said in the name of Rabbi Hoshaya that the law follows the words of the disciple, in other words, Rabbi Yonah of Batsra, who was a disciple of Rabbi Hoshaya, and agrees that the etymology of the word for the Libyan and Egyptian is going to be connected. So again, the best kind of mule around were these types of mules from Libya, and this name comes up in the Shas many times, and it's always referring to a better quality, better kind of donkey. And in any case, as far as Kilayim, even though it may be big and large and tall and even look like a camel in some way, that just because it looks like a camel, you can't tie it to a camel. So the next part, where it's saying about everything Rabbi Yehuda said about the female donkey and the female horse and mixing and switching the pairs. So the Gemara says that the opinion of the sages is that all types of mules are the same. In other words, both kinds of mules are the same species and permitted. So, in other words, Rabbi Yehuda is saying that only when you have the same parentage for the mixed breed is it allowed to be bred. The sages are saying that it doesn't matter whether it's the same parentage or whether sexes are switched. It's the same as long as it's from that generation. In other words, what the sages are saying is as long as you have, out of the 4 grandparents there, you have 2 horses and 2 donkeys, that's going to be enough. And there would be a problem if you tried to breed something to, say, that had 3 horses and 1 donkey as a parentage for the lineage of grandparents with something that's, say, 2 and 2, or even, all 4 being to a horse. So in other words, Rabbi Yehuda is saying that, look, if you have the 2 and 2, so the parentage is going to be, 2 horses, 2 donkeys, but the sexes are switched between the mother and father for, the grandparents, that's going to be a problem. Sages say that's no problem. It doesn't matter if you have it where the sexes are switched when you're going to try to breed the children animals to one another. The only problem is, according to the sages, is when it's not going to be the same species, even though it's a Kilayim species, it's not going to be the same species if the number of grandparents is going to be different from one another. So if you're mating this animal that's going to be a mule that has 2 horse and 2 donkey grandparents, and you're going to be mating it to a mule that has 3 horse and 1 donkey grandparent, that is going to be a problem. It's going to be like different species. So to look at the ruling of Rabbi Yehuda, again, Rabbi Yehuda's point is that you can't switch the species of what you're mating between the male father, male mother, the female mother, and vice versa with the opposite animal between the male and the female. So the Gemara is going to try to tell, how does Rabbi Yehuda even tell which is which? How can you tell from the first place that which is going to be the female horse mother or the female donkey mother? from the father? How do you know the lineage? And the Gemara says these are signs of a mule's lineage. Rabbi Yonah said any mule whose ears are small, the mother is a horse and the father is a donkey. And any mule whose ears are large, the mother is a donkey and the father is a horse. And Rabbi Manna instructed those functionaries of Rabbi Yudah Hanasi's household and said if you want to buy mules for the carriage of the Nasi, you should buy for him those whose ears are small. In other words, that the mother is going to be a horse. And because the characteristic of the mule shows that the mother's a horse and the father's a donkey. So all the mules that you buy will be of the same parentage, and then you don't need to worry about Kilayim. So that's an interesting insight. Now, we saw a Mishnah before in chapter 8, Halacha 2, saying that nobody's allowed to use a donkey or a mule like for pulling or even to sit on it. But as we can see, Rabbi Yudah and the sages both disagree with Issi ben Akavia, who was ruling before in chapter 8, Halacha 2, that is forbidden to even ride on a single mule. And certainly we see that the house of the Nasi disagreed that you can't use a mule because he's using it for the wagon. But the question is, well, if Rabbi Manna is instructing them to only buy the mules who have small ears, well, maybe he's going to be agreeing with Rabbi Yudah. So the Gemara is going to support for Rabbi Yonah's assertion that the ears of a hybrid are going to resemble those of the mother. And the Gemara says that the white substance that's going to be the semen from the person is formed from the man, and that's going to be to determine the brain, the bones, and the sinews and how that's formed. And the red substances, like blood, from which a person is formed from the woman, is going to be for skin, flesh, and blood. And the ruach, nefesh, and neshama are from the Holy One, blessed is He. And all three, in other words, the child's father, mother, and also the Holy One, are partners in creating him. So the Gemara qualifies the opinion of the sages, and Rabbi Ba says of Rabbi Yudah in the name of Rav that the sages who disagreed with Rabbi Yudah and rule that all the mules are the same species agree with Rabbi Yudah regarding a hybrid horse that is the offspring of a horse that itself is the offspring of a donkey, that it may not be paired with a hybrid donkey that is the offspring of a donkey that's itself the offspring of a horse. So again, the sages are going to be saying that they agree with Rabbi Yudah if the number of grandparents is going to be different. So if you're putting opposite sex together with the opposite sex, the problem comes when you have three of the grandparents being one thing and one of the grandparents being something else, and then you're trying to mate that now with an animal that has 2 and 2. So in that case, you're going to have a problem. And the sages are permitting the pairing of 2 mules only when they have the same ratio of horse and donkey grandparents. And this case is looking that the hybrid, if the hybrid is going to be more horse than donkey or more donkey than horse, because 3 of the grandparents are horses or 1 is donkey, then this is going to be like a different species. So even though the sages are going to view 2 hybrids as different kinds of animals, which by the way can't be mated or led together, that's not going to be the case if they have the same number of parentage. So they're going to say that the mule is going to be like its own species, and you can mate it with also a mule because it's also like its own species. The only wrinkle comes up if they don't have the same number of grandparents. So if something is more donkey or more mule, that's going to be forbidden, and even if you switch the sexes, that's going to be forbidden. Now, the Gemara is going to apply the principle in a parallel case. Rabbi Haggai cited Rabbi Zera in the name of Rabbi Issa that the offspring of goats and the offspring of sheep are forbidden with one another, and the Gemara explains and says, are we not saying the following? Certainly, Rabbi Issa was not speaking of mating ordinary goats with ordinary sheep. That's going to be obviously Kilayim. What are we referring to here? It's referring to something that is like what we were talking about with the donkey or the horse. So that's going to be a case where you already have a hybrid goat, and you already have an offspring of a goat that itself is the offspring of a sheep. So in other words, that's already been hybridized. So you have basically what that's like is a female sheep that mated with a male goat and produced a female sheep hybrid, and that hybrid has mated with a male goat and produced another hybrid, which is going to be now more sheep than it is goat. So the Gemara says that a hybrid goat that is the offspring of a goat that itself is the offspring of a sheep, coupled with a hybrid sheep that's the offspring of a sheep that itself is the offspring of a goat. In other words, what's that being mated with? That this female goat is being mated with a male sheep that produced a female sheep hybrid, and that hybrid is being mated with a male sheep and producing another hybrid that is more sheep than goat. Because the sages view all hybrids as belong to the same species. But what Rabbi Issa is teaching is that this combination is forbidden according to the sages. Why? Because one is going to be predominantly a goat and the other is going to be predominantly a sheep. In other words, what this is trying to teach is that you have 4 grandparents, and one of the grandparents is going to be a sheep and 3 is going to be a goat, and they're going to try to match that offspring with an animal that has three grandparents that are a sheep and one that's going to be a goat. So in other words, one is going to be more sheep than goat, and one is going to be more goat than sheep. And that's going to be a forbidden mixture. Now, if you had something that was 2 and 2, in other words, 2 of the grandparents were goat and 2 of the grandparents were sheep, the sages are going to say that that's going to be permitted because it's like the same species. But if they have, even if they have 3 and 3, this is where the sages are going to be agreeing with Rabbi Yehuda, because if you have 3 and 3, that's not enough, because if these 3 are like goats and one part is like sheep, and these ones are 3-part sheep and 1 part goat, that's going to be where it's really like 2 different species, and that's going to be Kilayim. Now, again, you're not allowed to go and mix these to start these, but again, these animals do pasture, and perhaps this can happen. And I've seen in pictures of zoos that they have these sort of hybrids. And in chapter 8, Halacha 4, the next year we're going to talk about mules. Have a great day.